Hi, we're going to be starting Chapter 19 today on speciation, which is how species begin. We talked in Chapter 18 about microevolution, how a species itself can evolve. Well, now we're talking about higher taxonomic levels, anything from genus all the way up through levels like the kingdom and so on, and how those groups may evolve, which would involve splitting one group into multiple groups, which would be the beginning of species. So, we need to start by defining what we mean by species, which is more difficult than you'd think it would be. Species means a kind of organism, but exactly how to define that gets suddenly much more difficult. Actually, every other level above species is only useful in terms of grouping things, but species is supposed to actually mean something in biology. Now, what the word itself means, it comes from the same word as specific. It means a kind of something. And as far as how we use it, it's something that is not as specific as like a race or breed. So if we say someone is Caucasian, that's being more specific than species. Or if we're talking about dogs and we say like a Cocker Spaniel, that's being too specific. So a dog would be a species. But the actual definition suddenly gets very difficult when we try to figure out biologically what does this mean. If dogs are a species, does that mean birds are a species? And the answer is no. So the way we usually try to describe it is we talk about all the members of one group that in nature will interbreed with each other successfully. So something like birds don't all interbreed successfully because a cardinal would not interbreed with a sparrow or a pigeon for so on or something. So we consider those each to be separate species. However, with dogs, a Cocker Spaniel and a Poodle can interbreed, so they would be part of the same species. But there are some areas where we have some difficulty here, like something like a lion and a tiger. They don't interbreed in nature because they're not found on the same continent. However, if you bring them together, they can interbreed successfully. Or something like a polar bear and a grizzly bear. And some of these areas, at different times, people have either grouped these things as one species or not grouped them as one species. And it does leave areas open for debate in how we organize the grouping of different species. But one thing we do know about speciation is that in order for it to take place, we need something called isolation. If you're going to have one group split into two groups, we can't have gene flow between them. We talked about gene flow in Chapter 18, and we said gene flow will keep two groups all the same species. So in order to make them two separate species, we've got to have something that blocks the gene flow between them. So what we're looking for is a way for the gene pools of the two species to be separate so that as each gene pool evolves and changes, they would evolve and change differently enough that they would no longer become the same species. And so we take all those different ways that this could take place, all the different ways that isolation could take place, and put them into two categories. We talk about geographic isolation, where it's geography, like physical boundaries that are keeping the two populations from having gene flow between them. Or we talk about reproductive isolation, where the two groups are in the same area geographically, but they're not able to reproduce with each other for some reason. And we'll get into some different ways that could take place in just a little bit. Now, an example we have here of how speciation could take place, this is a salamander species, and the ancestral population, being one single species, gets separated by actual physical boundaries. This is in the state of California. Some of the population moves eastward, some moves westward, and in between they can't cross over. And over enough time of the two species changing, they become two separate species that are no longer part of the same one. And even though they may come back together over time, they're no longer going to be able to interbreed, so they'll stay two separate species. Now, we said we'd have different types of reproductive isolating mechanisms. We have several different ones. We'll run through some of the key ones here. One type is something we call mechanical isolation. Probably the easiest one to understand. It's just when two things are physically unable to mate. And at the most extreme level, we could say something like, a squirrel and a tree obviously can't mate with each other for physical reasons. They just don't have parts that match up. But even if you take something that is currently a species, like dogs, it's pretty easy to see that something like a Chihuahua and something like a Great Dane are not going to be able to physically interbreed. And if those were the only two breeds of dog, those things would be on their way to becoming two separate species due to a lack of gene flow between them. Because we have this whole spectrum of dogs from small to large, as they are able to interbreed from one level to another, they're still all going to stay one species, at least for now. There are behavioral isolations, and these are things where a certain behavior is important in order for species to breed with each other, for the males and females to select each other. We see this especially in things like birds with courtship displays. A courtship display may only be attractive to one certain species, and to one certain individual, and if the male or female who's supposed to be doing the courtship dance does it wrong, there may not be another member of their species willing to mate with them. I'm going to pause for a minute and load up a video. In the video we have here, these are some species of bird of paradise that are doing some courtship dances. You can see this is a male trying to attract a female, and if he doesn't do this dance exactly correctly, a female won't be willing to mate with him. So you can imagine if you have an individual that because of some mutation or some change in genes is doing his courtship dance incorrectly, if a female won't reproduce with him, then he can't pass those genes on. But if there's a group within a species that is able to, within one group, accept one courtship dance, in a different group a slightly different courtship dance is acceptable, those may split into two separate species here. And some of these courtship dances get very intricate and, to us, often very strange. So, another isolating mechanism in terms of reproduction would be temporal isolation. There are different breeding seasons for species, and if you have one species that breeds in the spring, a different one breeds in the fall, it's going to keep them from interbreeding. It'll stop the gene flow from between them. Sometimes two individuals may breed, and it looks to be a successful thing. Physically they can, there are no problems with behavior or time of year, but maybe a case simply where the sperm and eggs simply don't fuse together. We call that a gamete incompatibility. And then the cases, most famous case would be something like a mule, where there is a successful breeding in terms of producing an offspring. However, that offspring is not able to, on its own, survive and reproduce. We call that either a weak hybrid or a sterile hybrid that wouldn't be able to pass on its own genes. That would be a case still where there's, even though again it appears to be a successful breeding, would not be successful enough to keep gene flow going between a couple of groups. Now when we talk about speciation, we now also talk about different types of speciation. So we had types of isolation. Now we're saying if we form species, these are two ways that species form. One type is called allopatric, and allopatric speciation is when there's an actual physical boundary between them. So when the isolation is a geographic isolation, that'd be an allopatric speciation. And because the only thing stopping gene flow here is just simply the fact that they aren't physically in the same area, this is something that we expect to take place over a long period of time, where just due to just changes in the allele frequencies, changes in the gene pools in the two groups, over time they become less and less similar to each other and would become eventually two separate species. Now sympatric speciation, the other type, is in one single area. And for it to be in the same area, there must be something that happens very suddenly that stops the two populations from interbreeding. So this is probably one of those reproductive isolations, something like a behavioral issue or a genetic issue, possibly a mutation that happened in one single individual that kind of branched it off into its own subset of the overall population, but the two subsets stop interbreeding and they'll become two separate species. Now, like we said, usually with sympatric speciation we assume that's due to a mutation or some new combination of genes that hasn't existed before, leading to new phenotypes. Or it may be a case of just there's a niche available that wasn't there before that's allowed some individuals to move in, and now they just physically stop interacting even though they really are in the same area. They're different niches. Now I always had trouble remembering which speciation was which, so I have kind of a silly little way to keep them straight that works for me. Maybe it'll work for you too. When I picture allopatric speciation, I always picture it in extreme. Oh, little interruption there. You have to blame Lexi Morford for that. So I was saying, a way to remember the difference between allopatric and sympatric. I picture in allopatric two little mountain goats. I don't know why I picked that species, but I always have. Kind of on top of two mountains, and they can't get through between because there's a river between the two mountains. So they're calling to each other. They're calling to their friends, and I picture them calling out, "Hello, hello," but they can't reach each other. So in my mind, this always worked to help me remember what allopatric speciation was compared to sympatric. That's the end of the first part of Chapter 19. As always, I hope you took notes on this, and if you have any questions, please bring them to class. And if you ever want to discuss any of these ideas a little bit more, again, make sure you come to me. The idea here is to make sure that you're really understanding all parts of it. Go back and watch any parts you want to. I'm trying to talk a little quickly, but you can always rewind and watch parts over again that you need to. And I just want to make sure you remember always that my job here is to support you, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.